For nearly 20 years now, Sword and Shield has been my favorite weapon in the Monster Hunter series. And over those 20 years, I've watched it receive a lot of different buffs, quality of life adjustments, changes to their core combo, and just about everything else you could possibly want to keep a weapon fresh. This iteration that Monster Hunter Wilds offers us is so far and above and beyond the best iteration of Sword and Shield that I have ever seen. What makes it so much better, you might be asking? Well, it's not even necessarily a mechanic that is unique to Sword and Shield. It's the introduction of focus mode in combination with perfect guards. You see, in my mind, Sword and Shield's strength has always been its jack of all trades nature. It may not always be the best at doing DPS. It is certainly not the best at knocking out monsters. It also doesn't have the greatest reach, meaning sometimes if you're trying to sever a tail of a specific monster, you may have a hard time reaching it unless it's writhing on the ground. And in terms of its blocking capability, Sword and Shield was always on the weaker end of that. Being the smallest shield in the entire game, you wouldn't expect it to be able to tank attacks like a lance can. So more often than not, if you lose faith in your capability to dodge attacks and instead decide to block, sometimes you're going to end up flying backwards, losing half your stamina, possibly half your health, and as a result of these things, potentially lose a lot of uptime on the boss after recovering from that brutal attack and the damage and stamina loss you took from doing so. Luckily for us Sword and Shield enjoyers, perfect blocking and focus mode have pretty much fixed these two problems almost entirely. Let's go over focus mode first. If you haven't picked up the game or played it yourself yet, focus mode is essentially a mode that allows you to freely aim your character around 360 degrees. Essentially, you can charge up a greatsword's charge attack and change the direction drastically even while you're holding the button down, allowing you to freely aim and adjust for monster movements. On face value, this doesn't sound like the most important thing for Sword and Shield. After all, SNS attacks are relatively low commitment, and it shouldn't be a big deal if a monster moves a bit because the moves come out pretty quick and you were probably aiming in the right place in the first place. Well, ideally anyway, it doesn't always work out that way in practice. Regardless, monsters tend to move around quite a bit and they can make some pretty drastic movements in a quick amount of times, and this allows you to maintain focus on a specific part of the monster. After all, despite Sword and Shield's lack of reach in their attacks, that is how they always broke monster parts effectively. They can focus a monster's leg repeatedly, very effectively, get them to trip, and then get some decent uptime on the parts they wish to break or sever. The amazing thing is, we don't even necessarily need to do that anymore, because with focus mode comes a focus strike. Every weapon has one. Focus mode typically allows you to aim 360 degrees around your character in a front-facing way that you can normally always swing, but Sword and Shield does this frontal lunge like you're stabbing a rapier, and you can actually stab up into the air. The best part is even without a wound active on the target, this attack does respectable damage with minimal starting time and pretty good end lag. And the best part is if the part is about to be wounded but not quite wounded yet, sometimes it does a double hit, resulting in quite a lot of damage for a very quick targeted attack. Those things also make it an incredibly effective melee weapon for targeting every single wound that pops up on a monster's body. Some other melee weapons struggle to activate wounds effectively, but Sword and Shield is not only quick and targeted, but you can also use it as the finisher to sliding swipe instead of the usual, well, swipe. This makes playing Sword and Shield feel almost as if you've taken on the role of the world's most pissed off wasp that will not leave a poor, defenseless dragon alone. Oh, but don't worry, because the benefits of focus mode do not end there, because let's talk about sliding swipe. I actually don't remember what game it was introduced in, but all I know is in previous titles, whenever I accidentally use sliding swipe, I kind of hated it. I also now realize that I might have been mistaking that with Charge Blade's version, which I also hate it. But I also gotta be willing to admit that when I play Sword and Shield, I can be a little bit of a walking train wreck sometimes, just spamming like it's the good old days of doing triangle, triangle, circle, circle, triangle, triangle, circle, circle for eternity. So sometimes I would be carrying on doing my usual Sword and Shield things, and then I would just all of a sudden do this sliding dash out of nowhere, and I don't want to do it. But now, thanks to focus mode, this has become one of my most used tools for Sword and Shield, even disregarding the fact that it can end in a focus stab. As it turns out, the one thing it was missing for me to use this ability a lot and actually not get grief by it was the ability to change the direction I want at any time, and then also change the direction I'm attacking at the very end. Now I feel the new version that we have with focus mode is even better than the older version, even if it had full evasion and evade extender. Not to mention, you also combine just how effective the new version is with focus mode with just how clean the monster hitboxes have gotten. It's incredibly good at dodging with no extra help. Now let's talk about perfect guard. Sword and Shield was never really much of a defensive weapon. It was in the sense that you are very nimble, you're low commitment, you can even use items while your weapon is drawn for most of the series' lifespan. This all led to Sword and Shield being a pretty newbie-friendly weapon. But in terms of actually blocking with Sword and Shield, as I mentioned earlier, it's almost always a last resort. It's not something you wanted to do unless you had to do. You could invest in guard and guard up and make it a substantially tankier weapon, but by doing so, you're losing out on a lot of potential damage. You also had the option to instead invest in evasion or evade extender, or potentially both, and then play the Dark Souls life and just roll around the boss being aggressive that way. Now we live in a world where Sword and Shield can do better than both of those options with just the base things it comes with out of the box, with the only exception for Perfect Guard being you need at least one level of guard up if you want to be able to block otherwise unblockable attacks. And thanks to Perfect Guard, you don't need as much guard as you used to, although even with Perfect Guard, sometimes you will find multi-hit attacks and other things that will bypass your Perfect Guard and hit you multiple times, so it's not exactly a bad thing to have a Sword and Shield that comes with 3 levels of guard or guard up on it. What Perfect Guarding allows Sword and Shield to do even more effectively is take advantage of the incredibly powerful armor skill Offensive Guard. Sword and Shield can use this anyway, but typically in past games, guarding is something you didn't want to do and you otherwise weren't rewarded for outside of activating an armor skill like this. Now whenever you Perfect Guard with Sword and Shield, not only will you activate your Offensive Guard, but that Perfect Guard is also going to open up your counter swing, which you can then chain into some of the most powerful attacks Sword and Shield currently has. But don't worry, it gets even better than that. For the longest time, Sword and Shield has had this garbage ass ability called Guard Swing. Actually, I don't know if that's its official attack name, but it's the little horizontal side swipe you do whenever you're guarding. It's terrible, it was never particularly useful, but now it's effectively a parry that punches back. While the damage it does is nothing impressive, whenever you can afford to just get a little bit of extra damage in for literally no extra cost, why wouldn't you do it? And as a little bonus, if you play on PC with keyboard and mouse controls, you can bind this action to one single key press, which is always nice. And as a bonus, it also works as your little jump back combo if you just hold back when you press it. The end result of this, on top of just the general combo changes to Sword and Shield, has left this to be one of the most aggressive weapons I've ever played in the series. You honestly do feel like a dual blader, except you have even more defensive options. And while I can't necessarily speak to its DPS because that's just kind of something I don't care about much in Monster Hunter. If a weapon is weaker, so be it. I've enjoyed Insect Glaive in many games, despite that it's usually on the lower end. But Sword and Shield this time by no means feels like a weak weapon. The insane amount of uptime you can generate on an enemy with very little effort leads it to just doing insane levels of damage, a lot of wounds, a lot of knockdown, and it is incredibly effective at breaking monster parts. Not to mention just natural traits of the weapon like being able to KO monsters, being able to do frequent aerial attacks even from the ground. This weapon really has it all.